Good evening. Welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. I am Sean Morales Doyle, Deputy Director of Voting Rights and Elections in the Democracy Program. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law. We are partnered in producing this event with NYU's John Brennan Center, which advocates for civil debate on politics and public policy, and NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible NYU student the information they need to cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/nyu-votes for lots of resources about registering and voting. That's nyu.edu/nyu-votes. Tonight, we're here to discuss efforts around the country to restore voting rights to people with convictions. As many of you surely know, across most of our country, there are criminal disenfranchisement laws in effect that deny many of our neighbors living and working in the community the right to vote. These laws have historical roots in efforts to prevent Black citizens from voting, and due to the racism inherent in our criminal justice system, they continue to have a disproportionate impact on people of color. Fortunately, there are people all over the nation working to roll back these laws, and we're grateful to have a number of these leaders here to discuss this from across the country. I want to introduce each of them and also to give you a quick sense of where things stand in their respective states. I'll start by noting that we have, in a way, recently entered a new era on this issue. For our nation's entire history, there have been states that permanently disenfranchised everyone convicted of a felony. As of 2018, there were only 3 states left with that policy: Florida, Kentucky, and Iowa. Then, in 2018, Florida's voters passed a constitutional amendment putting an end to the policy. Jody Polk is here from Florida. She's founder and director of LEA, the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub, director of community justice at the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding, and a 2018 Soros Justice Advocacy Fellow. Then, after Florida's historic move, in December 2019, Kentucky's governor began using his clemency powers to start automatically restoring voting rights to people in that state. Tana Fogel, a democracy fellow at Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, joins us to talk more about Kentucky. Finally, just over a week ago, Iowa's governor began using her clemency powers to automatically restore voting rights to people in that state. Daniel Zeno, the policy and advocacy director at the ACLU of Iowa, joins us to discuss that exciting development. So now, literally just days ago, for the first time ever, there is automatic rights restoration of some form across the entire country. But we also have reason to be hopeful for more change in the near future. And last but not least, our final panelist is Taina Vargas Edmond, the co-founder and executive director at Initiate Justice in California. In that state, there's a proposition on the ballot in November, Proposition 17, which would restore voting rights to people on parole and amend California's constitution. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Before jumping in, I want to invite those listening to share your questions for the panel. Type them in the Q&A box and we'll take as many as we can during the program. I want to start with a question for Daniel. And I want to start with this question because I think it kind of ties together a number of the things we're going to be talking about today, because as you all just heard, the changes to these laws can take a number of different forms. And in Iowa, we saw a big push, and that Daniel was very involved in, to try to get the Constitution amended to put an end to permanent disenfranchisement in Iowa. They didn't quite get there, but then as that was sort of falling apart a bit in the legislature, and I'll let you explain a little bit more, Daniel, there was a lot of advocacy to the governor, who decided to use clemency powers that she had to restore voting rights to people that way. And that's something that another Iowa governor had done in the past, and it's kind of switched back and forth between governors. So I want to ask you, Daniel, if you can speak to the way that these different approaches to reform kind of interact with one another, and then maybe we can hear from others about that question as well as it's played out in their states.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's been a long journey in Iowa. The Iowa Constitution disenfranchises people, and because of some Iowa Supreme Court cases, in fact, a litigation that the ACLU of Iowa was engaged in to challenge that, we weren't successful. And so in 2014 or 2015, the ACLU of Iowa, in coalition with over 20 organizations across the state, decided, you know what, we're just going to go for the gold and go for changing the Iowa Constitution. And at that time, it really was a pipe dream. It was something that we knew would take a long, long, long time. In 2005, then Governor Vilsack had issued an executive order restoring voting rights. In 2011, then Governor Branstad took it back. And so we got to the place where we said, we got to have a permanent change. We can't be in this place where every couple of years the governor changes the regime for who can vote. And so we worked very hard, and eventually in January of 2019, Governor Reynolds, a Republican, publicly supported changing the Iowa Constitution, which was a huge shift. And while eventually we weren't successful in getting that through the legislature, ultimately, we did change the conversation. And so we changed the conversation from should Iowa end lifetime disenfranchisement to when we end it, what is it going to look like? And that was a big shift. And so even though the constitutional amendment wasn't successful in 2020, that's where Iowa is right now, is what does it look like when we end this practice? And so as the legislature was ending their work, the protests across the country were also happening right here in Iowa. Des Moines Black Lives Matter was one of the leading organizations putting pressure on the governor to say, there's something you can do right now. You can issue an executive order to make this different and better right now. And it was a good challenge, but a challenge for organizations like the ACLU, others in our coalition like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, others, who generally do our work kind of in the system to navigate how do you coordinate with and be respectful of and responsive to the voices of people on the street who are saying, we're tired of waiting, do something now. And so that is an ongoing challenge that we're working through to continue to be responsive, to listen to the voices of people who are part of the protests, others who are saying, we can do this right now. And so because of all of that work, on August 5th, the Iowa governor issued an executive order restoring voting rights. We believe, thousands of people were impacted. Before the order was issued, about 60,000 Iowans were not able to vote. And so we're really excited about the work we got to do before November to make sure that legal right on paper becomes a real right so people can actually show up and vote in November.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, Daniel. Thank you. That last point you made there, I'm hoping maybe Tana, you can speak to this a little bit about how things are going in Kentucky, another state where we've seen big change recently. We've seen it again with an executive order, and also like in Iowa, an executive order that has some limitations in terms of who it reaches. Can you speak a little bit about the work that is being done in Kentucky to, as Daniel put it, sort of take that rights restoration on paper and turn it into actual civic engagement and involvement, and any challenges that you're facing in trying to get the word out to people?
First of all, I want to give honor to God, who's truly the head of my life, Sean. And without him, I would be nothing, because I am one of those individuals who have a felony in their past. And there are 312,000 or more Kentuckians who are just like me. And so it is true that our governor in 2019 signed an executive order for 170,000 folks to get their voting rights back. Senior Brashear, Governor Brashear, he also signed an executive order as he was leaving the governor's office, and then the following governor rescinded that executive order. So thank God, with all the work that we did in Kentucky to push and move Governor Brashear in his office, it was a lot of work done. But let me talk about the challenges as well as the accomplishments. Along with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth and a lot of coalitions, and I'm not going to start naming them because I'm going to forget some people and offend some people. So I'm just not gonna, they know who they are in Kentucky, and we're so proud to partner with them. But some of the things that we're doing is that we are reaching churches, we are making phone calls. We have a program called Through Text that we are locating that 170,000 and beyond voters here in Kentucky. And so during the pandemic, it is a challenge to get to those folks because things are done virtually. But however, we are setting up tables, we're going door to door, we got lit drops that we're leaving on people's doors, just talking about what's gonna happen in November. The education piece of getting out to vote is really difficult to do with individuals. And then just verifying that that list that exists here in Kentucky with the people who have felonies in their past, just going down that list and working with organizations and allies to help locate and educate and persuade folks that it is worth their while. One of the problems and challenges that we have is that during the pandemic and even before the pandemic, most politicians would not even come in the low income, marginalized, people of color districts and talk about issues that concern them. And so therefore, the enthusiasm about getting to the polls just did not exist. And then it started to dwindle. But now we have hope. We had a candidate that was running for the US Senate, and he talked about issues that Kentucky was really concerned with. As you all know that's listening, and as our panelists know, we are sitting in a state with a US Senator that is slow to act on policies that we need for healthcare, for voting, because voting goes beyond the ballot. And it really deals with people's issues. So those challenges that's in front of us, we take one challenge a day, and then we try to break that down, and we talk across the state. We meet virtually to see what is the best practices that we can use. And so I'm so excited about this election. Our constitutional amendment, Section 145 of the Constitution disenfranchises folks with felonies in their past, and 1 out of every 4 Black African-American people cannot vote. So we have a real challenge and a lot of work to do, but we're up for the challenge. And I probably missed some of the things that we do, but we have great panelists on here. So I'm gonna slow down, and if there's any questions around the state or around the nation, just put them in the chat and I'll be ready to answer those.
Yeah, and I wanna thank you, Tana. That was very helpful. I do wanna turn to Jody with some piece of this question as well, but before doing that, do you, what obstacles are you seeing in terms of the confusion that comes from, you know, the governor's order did restore voting rights to lots of people, as you said, but not to everybody. And as you also said, this is something that's changed over time. You know, there was one governor with one policy, another governor that went back, and then this governor has now gone back to restoring rights. What do you see in terms of how confusion impacts people's ability to exercise this newly restored right in a state like Kentucky that's dealing with that history?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of fear around voting here in Kentucky because of that confusion. Did the executive order cover me? Can I vote? Should I register? Our voting says that you definitely are going to go to jail if you're not supposed to be voting. The other confusing part of this is our mail-in ballot. We are yet to get the word from our Secretary of State. Can we mail our vote in? Can we not? What's the process? What is the county clerk's gonna do? Because in the primary, there was just so much to do and so much confusion about how to fill out your absentee ballot, when to turn it in. So when people get confused like that, and they're also worrying about if they got dinner tonight, or if they got enough gas to get to work, or do they even have a job? So with all that mass confusion, some people kind of drop off. And so our job is to keep them interested, try to give them some hope, keep showing them through my experience and other people like me who are working as teams to get people eligible to vote. And we sign on. There is a website here in Kentucky. It's the Civil Rights Restoration, www.civilrightsrestoration.org, where individuals can go on, put their information in. But what about those individuals that don't have computers? So that's another challenge we have, is just technology. So I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely. No, it was very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm dealing, I'm getting used to the Zoom panel thing. I don't want to interrupt you. It's harder to give the cues and that kind of thing. So no, it was fantastic. Thank you. So Jody, Florida, thankfully, is a place where this no longer is a back and forth executive order kind of situation, which we had for a long time in Florida, but we have a constitutional amendment. It's permanent, or as permanent as anything is, and there's rights restoration now, but that doesn't mean there's not confusion, and I'm hoping you can speak to a little bit of how that confusion is coming up in Florida, and I know part of that is because there's an ongoing battle about exactly what Amendment 4 means, that we're very involved in. But also, I think Tana started pointing to a couple things that I know you and I have spoken about a lot, about how there's more to civic engagement and empowerment than simply changing the law to give someone the right to vote back. And there's more to actually making people feel like democracy is an option, a real option that is available to them and that gives them agency in their lives than simply restoring their right to vote. And so I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit and how that's playing out in Florida in the wake of this huge victory that was Amendment 4.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. And so, I mean, honestly, mirroring what Tana was saying, in Kentucky, and it's, interesting to hear so many deep similarities, but a lot of times we label people as disenfranchised, or these are marginalized, or, we understand like the historic, narrative of who people are and why they are disenfranchised. But these are also specifically in Florida, in Gaines, Florida, these are also isolated communities. And so these are communities that are just typically living life truly unaware of the reality, the impact, the realness, of law and policy, and just how that shapes and governs our lives. I too am a formerly incarcerated woman. During my time in the Florida Department of Corrections, I was what's called a jailhouse lawyer. I was a law clerk. And so I was always surprised at how many people would get to prison and not even know, legally how we got in there. And so a lot of times the criminal justice system is the only system that a lot of, isolated community members are like frequently, interacting with in a way. And so that has, been a big part of the confusion. We too have just creatively, especially being directly impacted individuals, these communities, apart communities, have looked at creative ways of how can we encourage, as Tana was saying, you don't teach citizenship. We believe at LEA, that it's inspired, you're encouraged. And that's what gives me the hope to do and be who I am, even when Florida, doesn't label me as such. And so we were just seeing how people were getting discouraged with all of the back and forth, with all of the communication. A lot of times there's this big misconception that everyone is on YouTube, everyone is, on watching the news, or, plugging into political information. And so thinking about who's even sharing this information. If it wasn't for, I mean, literally not partners, but friends now that I would call them at various, the league, at the Brennan Center, at NYU, that were constantly calling me and having regular conversations with me about what was going on. When you're thinking about what people are surviving and going through, the reality that you're sitting down reading, that you're really following. And so it became very discouraging. Our media doesn't always give us just an accurate point blank, perception of what's going on. And so again, seeing some of, the issues that have happened with incarceration, that have happened for some people around, voter disenfranchisement, and then going to the ballots and registering to vote. A lot of us didn't know what it was. We didn't know like what the final standpoint, would be. And so also, not every county is the same. I live in Alachua County, where it's definitely, progressive, and we had a supervisor of elections and just a community of leadership that didn't just want to figure this out, but they wanted to figure it out in favor to the community residents, who were directly impacted. And so while that didn't provide all the answers, it at least, gave us an opportunity to create some type of bridge, around information, where in the communities, because there was no final decision, your supervisor of elections, your leadership in smaller counties could have just not cared, to share information. And so really, again, keeping people inspired and keeping people, encouraged. But we definitely had to also make sure that we were engaging people to not just have a flyer or a pamphlet and more information about what was going on, but really like how we having conversations, about what's going on in a way, because it was key for us, specifically at the Amendment 4 was passed, on how do we encourage and how do we really bring, voting as a strategy to our local isolated neighborhoods. We had to really do that work of connecting voting to the issues that we were seeing inside of our neighborhoods. And so now we are thoughtfully, having these conversations with jailhouse lawyers, in the library, prison, before people, even come home. Even we recognize that probation officers, because of just like the confusion, we had probation officers that were not sharing accurate, information, and not sometimes because they didn't want to, but because it was so changing, so moving. It was like, who knew? And so it was more so like, a theory. And so we definitely had to expand access, keeping folks encouraged. But again, when you're a part of a system that just never acknowledged you, or you never knew it was there, with all this political back and forth, it feels sometimes like it's getting further and further away from people. So we literally have to, reach out with hands, and try to hold it as close to the ground until we can start seeing some of the victories, and also just encouraging more of those conversations around the realities in Florida, as well as the visions and next steps in Florida.
Thank you for that. So first, I just want to mention, because I'm not sure, I'm sure there are some people watching that know some of what's going on in Florida, but to give a little bit of context for some of what Jody and I are talking about here, after Amendment 4 passed, a law was passed by the Florida legislature that said that Amendment 4 said you have your rights restored upon completion of all terms of sentence, including probation and parole. And then a law was passed by the Florida legislature that said completion of all terms of sentence requires you to pay off all the fines and fees and restitution and costs that you owe. And in Florida, like in many states, Florida heaps debt on people involved in the criminal justice system, and levies over $1 billion every few years in fines and fees, et cetera. Billion with a B, if that's not clear. And the Brennan Center and others have been suing Florida over that law now for over a year, and we've had a number of victories, but our victory is currently on hold while we're up on appeal in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And I can just say that as a lawyer who is actively litigating this case, I am not entirely clear on who is eligible and who is not. The state of Florida, the director of elections testified in our trial, she doesn't know who's eligible and who's not. So the confusion is very real in Florida, and hopefully we'll have some resolution to that. But a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that it's frankly impossible for many people to figure out whether they owe money or not. Even though we know lots of people owe money, Florida doesn't have like a one-stop shop where you can look up what you owe. And so there's a lot of confusion that comes, whether or not we know what the rules are, people just don't even know what it is that they owe. So I just wanted to give some of that context because I feel like some of what we're talking about might be, people might not be fully following. Taina, I want to turn to you now. Again, last but not least in my series of questions here, but a lot of what Jody was just speaking to reminded me of the phrase often used by the campaign in California, first for ACA 6, now Proposition 17 on the ballot, which is democracy needs everyone. And I'm wondering if you can speak for a minute about what that phrase means to you and what it means about the need for rights restoration.
For sure. Thank you, Sean. And, thanks y'all for having me on this panel. I'm so honored to be here with such an amazing group of advocates from across the country. So the phrase democracy needs everyone came from one of our currently incarcerated members by the name of Juan Haynes. Initiate Justice conducted a survey about a year and a half ago now, asking people in prison and on parole, like if you had your voting rights restored, would you actually vote? What would your policy priorities be? Because the opposition will often use the argument that people impacted by incarceration don't care about voting or somehow will vote for scary, dangerous things. And that's why we shouldn't allow people to have the right to vote. So when we conducted this survey, we put together a report that analyzed the results, and Juan wrote in his response, the question was, why do you want to have the right to vote? And he said, because democracy needs everyone. And that is something that became the title of our report. So folks can, check it out on our website. There's a lot of really good analysis about, how people impacted by incarceration view themselves as participants in the political system. But what that phrase means to me is, just what it says. Like, this is a democracy. Unfortunately, it's also a democracy that has been rooted in historical racism and sexism and systemic disenfranchisement for different categories of people. So it started off as saying that enslaved people could not vote, that indigenous people could not vote, that women could not vote. During the Jim Crow era, there were poll taxes and literacy tests and other ways to keep marginalized people out of the political process. And now the age of mass incarceration is our new systemic way of keeping people out of the political process. And I believe that in a democracy, this is, something that is just absolutely unacceptable. It's not rooted in any interest in public safety. Studies actually show that when people have their rights to vote either in prison, like they do in Maine and Vermont, or, as soon as they're released from prison, as is the case in I think 19 other states now, that the rates of recidivism go like way down, and the rates of violent offenses are also reduced. So if we're talking about creating a safe system, if we're talking about creating a just and fair system in a modern democracy, in a democracy that likes to be considered, a beacon of freedom around the world, then how is it that we have some of the harshest disenfranchisement laws out of any democracy in the world? Most other countries in the world most democracies in the world don't take away a person's right to vote, period. And in the United States, I believe that it's, purely based on our addiction to punishment and punitive justice.
And I want to follow up real quick on that with a question for you about, I think Jody was speaking earlier to the fact that within Florida, the way that this is being handled varies from county to county, depends on the politics. There are places that are more progressive, there are places that are more conservative, et cetera. I think most of us probably think of California as a relatively progressive part of the country. And yet, California, as you said, is behind 19 other states in Washington, D.C. here, right? And New York, another place that, I think people think of as a progressive place, also, at least on the books, denies people the right to vote while on parole, like in California. The governor there has been taking some action kind of similar to the ones we've been talking about with other folks today. But why do you think it is that we have this problem in a place like California that's progressive, and this, as you put it, addiction to incarceration, that is so closely linked with this. If you could speak to how that's playing out in a progressive place like California, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, well, California is progressive in many ways, and unfortunately, the justice system is not one of those places where we are very progressive. We have the largest prison population out of any state in the country. Actually, now we have the lowest population in over 30 years because of the COVID pandemic, and some folks are starting to be released. But we still have about 100,000 people currently incarcerated in state prisons and about 80,000 people in county jails. The LA County Jail, where I live, is the largest mental health provider in the country. So I think that, you know, we also just have a history of treating prisons and jails as our one-stop shop for social services. And, you know, because we have like built up this legacy, and that in conjunction with our addiction to punishment is where it becomes really difficult for us to move on CJ issues. And, you know, it seems like it would be very straightforward to say, you know, citizens in a modern democracy should be able to have the right to vote. But when we connect voting rights with punishment, and we see like the removal of the right to vote as part of that punishment, that is a way of thinking that is very difficult to challenge.
And then I think I want to pose this maybe to all the rest of the panelists, but I was thinking Jody and Daniel, you know, what we've seen in Iowa and in Florida, states that are dominated or you know, to varying degrees, but by a much more conservative brand of politics than in California, that this is an issue where there's, you know, there's actually, despite the struggles that Tangina's talking about in California, this is an issue where we see support across political lines. The ballot initiative in Florida, it required 60% of the vote for Amendment 4 to pass, and 64.5% of Floridians voted for it. And then in Iowa, we see a Republican governor come out and go further than the people of Florida went. And so I'm curious what both of you think about what it means, first of all, that at a time when we see so much polarization, we're seeing that kind of agreement on this issue, and also why you think we're seeing that kind of agreement on this issue. To either one of you, I know I've made it awkward now because you have to.
You know, and I have to say, so that was one of the first times, if Amendment 4 didn't do anything for me, because I'll never forget, I would have never known about Amendment 4. I wanted to go to law school. I was just interested in getting to law school. I found a formerly incarcerated lawyer that knew Desmond Meade and introduced me, and I was reaching out to Desmond, and, you know, I learned Amendment 4, you know, through that way. And so when then becoming a part of the campaign and working on the campaign, it was the first time in my life, you know, that I felt community in a big sense in Florida. I'd always felt it in my local neighborhood, but I have to say Amendment 4 was the first time as a Floridian that I ever felt that, you know, we were an entire community. And I'll never forget, because we didn't have a lot of bumps. I mean, it was almost like it went through that last year, you know, before the challenges really started to come. And I'll never forget, it was like, you know, when the governor put out that first appeal, and it was just like, for me, it was like, you know, we could have expected that. And I'll never forget, like, the league and, you know, other partners and people saying no. We said no. Even partners from out of state, you know, like the Brennan Center saying no. We said yes, and we meant yes. And so that was the second time I was like, okay, we really have community. I'll never forget working on the campaign, which I have to say is the first time I learned about the 13th Amendment. It was the first time I even knew what that meant, the first time I learned about working on a campaign to restore voting rights in Florida. And then I also learned that 70% of the people who were, you know, directly impacted in that 1.4, you know, million people who were disenfranchised were not even, you know, people of color. And just so, like, for the first time, I was like, whoa, you imagine, you know, that it's always the same people. The criminalized, it's the Black people, it's those poor Black people. It's like, for the first time in my life, I realized that incarceration impacted people beyond Black people. Beyond people in my neighborhood that looked like me, that were formerly incarcerated people. I'll never forget, because I was the Central Florida organizer, traveling between multiple counties, having conversations to encourage voters, and how many people that did not look like me, not in my age range, that was like me too. Or how many people shared a story about a child, or shared a story, you know, about a son. So it was amazing that when the lid came off, that, you know, for so many people, and it also so many people that whispered it, you know, whether they supported it out loud or not, I got a chance to see that it really impacted all of us, or a family member, in some type of way. And so I can't help but, you know, think about, I love the way Taina, you know, stated that this addiction to punishment. And so when you get caught in that cycle, you know, sometimes it's easy to imagine who it impacts, but it impacts, you know, a lot of us. And again, for Florida, you know, that other hidden truth of it was a whole community that existed outside of our local neighborhood. So those were two kind of personal impacts that I realized in Florida.
Yeah, similar to what Joe.
Before you start, Daniel, I just want to give one more plug to everyone watching to get your questions in, because we're going to switch to Q&A in a second. But sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
Similar to what Jody said, I mean, there was polling done in 2019 and in 2020 in Iowa that showed more than 50% of people across the political spectrum supported ending lifetime disenfranchisement. In my work traveling around the state, talking with legislators and talking with people across the state. So before the executive order on August 5th, 2020, Iowa disenfranchised every person convicted of every felony. So what that actually means in real terms is, if you damage property worth $1,501 or more, that's a felony in Iowa, right? And so when you really begin to talk about it that way, kind of what Jody said, that interconnectedness, you really hear from people who say, oh yeah, my cousin, my brother, my family member, my community member. And it's not just Black people in urban areas. Iowa is a very, very white state. But it's rural white people who were convicted of a felony when they were 22 and have never voted for 20 years. And so it really, I think, as we did the work and really started to connect those dots, people began to see, wait, this actually is about people in every county across the entire state. And if we re-enfranchise people and help people be able to participate, to vote for the mayor of their small town where everybody knows everybody, right? That actually starts to make communities and families and individuals better. And so I think it was, that's part of the excitement we have is when the governor signed the executive order on August 5th, she said, I'm signing this order, but I still want to work on a constitutional amendment. Because we know that we got to make this permanent, so that we no longer have to worry about who's in the governor's seat, but we know every Iowan will be able, every eligible voter in Iowa will be able to vote.
Thank you so much to everybody. I'm gonna try to switch to audience questions here now. And one of those questions, I think this panel is a great example. Demonstrates how much these efforts across the country are led by people who have been directly impacted by these laws. And I think that's part of what we were thinking with the name here. This is what democracy looks like, right? That you know, here we have efforts, democratic efforts, true democracy happening in practice, led by people who are formally locked out of the democratic system, right? Not allowed to cast a vote, but still leading these efforts to actually achieve true democracy. And so one of the questions we had here is about how allies of these efforts support and advocate alongside and in support of directly impacted people. But I think I want to ask that, I want to sort of add to that question and say, you know, for each of you and for anyone who wants to take this, what is the significance to you of the role that directly impacted people play in these movements? And then also, how does that interact with the role of others of us who are, you know, allied and working alongside and supporting and lifting up the voices of the directly impacted people? And how does that work best? And Tana, it's been the longest since you spoke, so if you want to take that.
So you know what, I want to share a story about impacted people standing strong and showing up. Here in Kentucky, when the Kentuckians of the Commonwealth we have mass phone banking across the state. As we are being empowered, I reach out and others reach out to other impacted people, and we get on the phones and we call folks when it's time to vote and thereafter. And impacted people really, what we used to say, put to shame folks who have the right to vote that don't vote. You know, we always raise up our voice, said, here we are, we're struggling, we're fighting for the democratic process, and that we really, really want to vote. You know, our state constitution that does not allow us to vote. I worked on the campaign for 14 years, and it was House Bill 70, trying to change the Constitution, just like Florida is working on and Iowa is working on. It is great to see folks who are impacted with the fact that we have lost our right to vote. If you ask me, when Judge Overstreet gave me those 10 years and said, complete this term, that's exactly what that means. My behavior should not have anything to do with how my mother taught me how to vote and how we go out and try to stand up for what is right. And so I think it's a great effort on everybody's part to show up, be loud. We practice, you know, sometimes we have to get radical, but we try to do it peacefully, and we let people know we made a mistake, but we're not a mistake, and that our voices should be heard, and that our behavior went with our misconduct. And usually all we're trying to do is get back to the dream, and the dream is to sit here and decide who's going to be on that school board for my children and my grandchildren. Voting is everything. And that's all I really want to say, so other panelists can have a part in this.
Thank you, Tana.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, you know, something that we often say at Initiate Justice is that impacted people are the experts of our own experiences. You know, my loved one was in prison for 7 years and spent 2 years on parole, so total, you know, spent 9 years without the right to vote. And I think often, you know, folks like my loved one or myself or the other people who we organize with are kind of viewed as people who are valuable for sharing our stories, but maybe not being thought leaders or, you know, lead organizers. So I think that, you know, some things that allies can do is, you know, trust our leadership, invest in our leadership, and help us, you know, to develop skills where they are necessary. I'm learning on the job right now with this Prop 17 campaign. I've never run a ballot initiative before, but I'm very grateful for allies who have, you know, leveraged their skills and experience and said, here, you are the expert in this because you're directly impacted by this. So here are some tools that you can have. Here is some advice. Here is some funding. Donate to grassroots organizations. And there's plenty of ways that you can do that. I think, you know, now in the age of the pandemic and Zoom, get creative, have a Zoom party, you know, do something, and, you know, contribute to your favorite local organization, because when we're doing this work, like from the bottom up, every dollar helps. You know, there are so many ways that folks can extend a hand to, you know, really like trust us and invest in our leadership.
And be prepared to do it outside of your office hours. I have to just say, people who are living real life are living life. Be prepared to do it after 6 o'clock, after 7 o'clock. Be prepared to break it down. Don't just send an email. Do not just, you know, call my phone. I mean, really, you know, be prepared to go the distance. It's about relationships, you know, and partnerships in addition to just And I also just have to say, like, when we think of directly impacted people, it's not just formerly incarcerated people, it's incarcerated people as well. We do some of the most amazing work in and through the prisons and the jails. And I mean, we are organized. And so be prepared to go beyond the box and beyond the time commitments, and recognize that we are the translators, you know, advocates and, you know, supporters. I'm thankful for the knowledge and, you know, privilege and power and all those words, you know, that people put to it. But at the same time, we're the translator. Like you said, Tana, we're the leaders. So come in a way that, you know, is true partnership.
And I just quickly add, look, meet people where they are and listen. Because I think often what happens is those of us that are allies, those of us who are in organizations that have power, resources, access, we show up and say, here's what we can do for you. How can you fit into that thing? I think you show up and you listen and you hear, oh, so you think this is the thing we should do, and then you work on that thing, right? Because I think that's where you really begin to build relationships and not just use people for your goals, but you're actually listening and helping using your power to help other people achieve the goals that they've set out. I mean, that's a really, really important part. And it's ongoing work. It's work that I continue to try to do every day, working inside the ACLU. And so it's not a one-time thing. It's something you got to keep working on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Danielle. Thank you, everybody. I'll just say I find this is not really a response to that question, but it's something that I want to say that I find what's so powerful. I appreciate what you said, Taina, about believing in people's leadership and supporting it, and that folks aren't just here to tell their story, but to actually do the democratic work and lead the work. And I think, to me, what's so powerful about that is that it kind of proves the point along the way, right? Like, whatever sense people think there is to criminal disenfranchisement laws, and I don't think there is much, but whatever sense they think that there is to denying people the opportunity to participate, I think seeing these movements led by the people who are locked out of democracy, seeing them perform democracy that way and engage in ways that your average citizen never dreams of engaging with democracy, really just proves the point that we're all trying to make about the importance of rights restoration and what it means when we say democracy needs everyone. And so this is why democracy needs everyone. Look at the way that folks are actually being democratic and engaging in democracy in ways that your typical citizen just doesn't, because it takes all of that work outside of business hours, et cetera. So I find it really powerful for that reason. Another question we got from the audience is how you all have worked to build the type of bipartisan support we were just talking about, and more generally, how advocates can learn from your experience to build stronger coalitions, to bring more people to the table to have this conversation and move the rights restoration forward. Again, I know this is weird on Zoom with him.
So for me, two amazing strategies, and I have to say there's so many, but what I've realized for me is that community peace building and legal empowerment are just two strategies, I mean, hands down, for me, that really helps people to not just choose whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or choose a side or choose an option, but it helps people to have their legal identity, to have identified, what are those, barriers, those triggers. I mean, I'm traumatized every time, I'm in one of these spaces or I'm going into the court. I mean, that never goes away, either. And so the peace building practices really gives people the opportunity to just, self-own this process for them, so that it doesn't matter how the politics and everything else is moving. It's personalized for you. And then in legal empowerment, recognizing that before a person can become a shaper of the law, you have to be a knower and a user. So really making sure that, just have the right answers, but we're asking the right questions and making sure that people can understand and people can practice, so that then people will be inspired and naturally shapers of the laws where they fit in, that meets their needs.
And I think similar to the points that Jody and Daniel were making earlier, a strategy that we used in California, because we had to move the legislature to pass the constitutional amendment, and now we're moving to the ballot in November. We really just built connections between policymakers and people directly impacted by incarceration. We were in the Capitol all of the time with people on parole sitting in their offices and talking about how they've been contributing to their communities, and not just since they've been home, but the work that they did when they were in prison as well. There's this idea that people in prison, or formerly incarcerated people, are somehow less than human and are not contributing members of society. But in my opinion, especially like being close to someone in prison for 7 years, folks in prison are doing a lot more work on themselves than the average person is out here. They are reading a lot more books. They are much more educated than the average voter. So when they come home, like, they're very well equipped to talk about what policies are a priority for them. So it has been really important for us to, just show the humanity of people impacted by incarceration, and like debunking a lot of these like really horrible and inaccurate myths that we have.
And so I'd like to say +1 to the speakers that went before me, and absolutely relationship building. Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is member-led all the way across Kentucky. And so as we work with other coalitions, especially the new coalition from the hood to the holler, and we embrace each other, issue-based is what is really helping us. The poor healthcare in Kentucky. We have a man that is a US Senator that is just sitting there. And so that is affecting everybody across the state, especially people who are just re-entering in the community, trying to get a new start. So relationship building and issue building is what those are just a few of the strategic things that we're doing. Other than going down to the Capitol in our old normal, we would always be in the Capitol. We would be in legislature's face, demanding to speak to them, demanding that they listen. And so those are some of the strategic ways that we move around in Kentucky.
And I'll just +1 on focusing on issues. So the ACLU, we're nonpartisan. We show up, and in Iowa, Republicans run the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. And there is a big picture narrative that is true, that generally speaking, Republicans are not the party that generally does positive voting rights things. And yet on this specific issue, the constitutional amendment that was introduced in Iowa was a governor's bill. The Republican governor introduced the bill, right? And so showing up and saying, look, we can disagree on all kinds of other stuff, but I think we actually agree on this one thing. Let's figure out how to work on it. Let's figure out how to make it better. And so really just focusing in on those specific issues.
Thank you, everybody. We're just about out of time. I'm going to ask another question that I think hopefully we can get a quick answer from everyone, but it's not going to be, we're not going to get as much from everyone as we'd like. But that's, we've seen a lot of progress on this issue, as all of you are living examples of in just the past couple of years around the country and in all of your states. Or maybe we're about to see that progress in California. So I'm wondering what you all think is the future of this movement, whether that means the legal future, or, we've heard from some of you about turning the rights on paper into actual civic engagement. And also I want to leave it open, like the future of the movement, very broadly speaking, or in your state, like, getting Proposition 17 passed or whatever that is. So leave that to each of you, and maybe we can start with Taina.
So in California, right now, the only folks who don't have the right to vote are people who are currently incarcerated in state or federal prison or on parole. So Prop 17 will remove those restrictions for people on parole. So I think the next step for us after that is removing all voting restrictions. I'm ready for California to join Maine and Vermont and be the next state where, or I guess now DC as well, and be the next state where you never lose your voting rights because of a conviction.
And also, more immediately, people should vote yes on Prop 17 in November.
And in Kentucky, removing the carve-outs that the governor has under the executive order is what I would say, so that everyone will be able to vote.
And in Iowa, I think we are focusing on educating people from the executive order that was issued last week so they can vote in November, and then already starting the work so that in 2021, we're working on the constitutional amendment again.
All right, Jody, take us out.
Yes, so the immediate statewide goal is that there be no confusion and that we also join that list of just, your rights is your rights, but personally, goal for in future for Florida is that your civil rights completely are restored. Voting rights is just one small right that I'm trying to get back. I want to see all my rights back.
Right.
All right, thank you so much to everybody. Our huge thanks to Tana Fogel, Jody Polk, Taina Vargas Edmond, and Daniel Zeno. We wish you all the very best of luck with all of your work and hope to continue to partner with all of you on this work. We're so grateful for your partnership. We're also grateful for the partnership of the NYU Brennan Center and NYU Votes for collaboration on this particular program. We encourage all students to vote. We really encourage everyone to vote, but since we're working with NYU Votes, we're going to focus right now on we encourage all you students to vote. A few more notes to bolster our democracy before we leave you. If you haven't already, please go complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. It is quick and the most efficient way to get this census done despite the challenges of the coronavirus pandemic. Tell everyone you know to make sure they get counted in 2020. If you can sign up to vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, please do so and tell your friends and family to do so. If you can't vote by mail and participate early in your state, call your local member of Congress and let them know you want those options to protect your vote and you want them to fund a safe, sanitary, free, fair, open election in November, despite the fact that we have a pandemic going on right now. I am Sean Morales Doyle. I'm the Deputy Director of Voting Rights and Elections at the Brennan Center. I thank you all so much for coming and supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. Please attend more of our events in the future. Thanks again to all of our panelists. Take care, everybody.